delighted to welcome a very special guest who also appeared during our online conference in 2021, where he shared his remarkable research on Göbekli Tepe, and especially on Pillar 43 and the analysis of that, and how that connects with very ancient astronomical and astrological symbols. So today he's going to be going further back in time and looking at the research from Lascaux all the way up to Göbekli Tepe, which in itself is nearly 12,000 years old. So he's come all the way down from Edinburgh, where he's an academic at the University of Edinburgh. He's also the author of a very important book called Prehistory Decoded. So please give a warm megalithomania welcome to Martin Sweatman. Thank you.
Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction, Hugh. It's very kind. It's great to be back in Glastonbury. It's been quite a long time since I was here last. So the tagline for this conference is, what were the ancients up to? And I suspect that one of the things that they were up to is recording meteor strikes in the best way that they could, which would have meant using art and symbols. And I'm going to show you some examples from Göbekli Tepe and Lascaux. And this makes a lot of sense, I think, because these meteor strikes would have been very damaging, very dangerous, very scary and bewildering. So it makes sense that they would want to record these events for future generations. So my interest in this subject began about 2008, when I first heard about Göbekli Tepe. But then I read Graham Hancock's book in 2016, Magicians of the Gods, and I think in his book is the essential key that allows us to understand Göbekli Tepe properly, and it allows us to decode more of the symbols at the Göbekli Tepe, more of the pillars, and even to apply the same kind of insight both to earlier cultures in Paleolithic Europe and later cultures in the Bronze Age. So anyway, I read Graham's book and found that with that key insight I could decode or I could interpret more of the symbols at Göbekli Tepe, and that led to this paper which featured in various newspapers and magazine articles. And I wrote that with my colleague Demetrius Sikritsis. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, what this paper was about. And then a few years later, after more research into the science and the archaeology, I wrote this book, and this talk is really going to follow the arc of this book, plus there'll be some additional new discoveries, some additional insights as well sprinkled on top. Now this area, this interpretation of Göbekli Tepe is featured in a couple of TV documentaries recently. The one I want to highlight to you is just out quite recently. So this is Forbidden History, Season 7, and Episode 3 in the United States. It's Episode 4 in the UK. And it describes this whole idea that links Göbekli Tepe to the Younger Dryas impact. So you can see that in the UK through Now TV and Sky TV. So if this is interesting to you, I recommend that you go and take a look. So I better describe the key outcomes from this paper that we wrote back in 2017. So I'm showing there three pillars from Göbekli Tepe. The middle pillar is Pillar 43, and we suggested that was essentially a memorial to the Younger Dryas impact. And we thought that because we could read, or we think it encodes a date, and that date is very close to the Younger Dryas impact. And it's encoded using, we think, precession of the equinoxes, where the animal symbols represent constellations. The pillar on the left there, Pillar 18, is another pillar in the same enclosure as Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe. We think that one probably symbolizes something related to the Younger Dryas comet, and that's because of the belt buckle and the loincloth there have the appearance of a comet. That idea was first made popular previously. And on the right there we have pillar 2, and we suggested that that encodes the path of the radiant of the Taurid meteor stream, and it's the Taurid meteor stream that is suggested to have caused the Younger Dryas impact. And so we see the bull as encoding a constellation similar to Capricornus, the fox as encoding a constellation similar to Aquarius, and the bending bird similar to Pisces. And at the time that Göbekli Tepe was occupied, or at the time of the Younger Dryas impact, that would have been the path in the sky, probably of the radiant, so the position in the sky where the meteors from the Younger Dryas comet would have emanated from. So I'll explain a little bit more about our reasonings in this talk as to why we think that's the case a bit later on. What I'm going to do now, though, is say a little bit about what the Younger Dryas impact is. So this is an impact event with it's thought to have involved lots of comet fragments within perhaps a single day. So rather than a single large impact, it's thought to be a multitude of comet fragments that impacted an entire hemisphere of Earth. So this is a widely distributed event, it's thought. And the kind of energy scale that we're talking about here, when you add up all of those impacts, is thought to be perhaps in the region of 1 million sort of Hiroshima-type nuclear bombs. So this is a massive amount of energy, and it would have significantly affected life on Earth. I reviewed the impact hypothesis myself in a paper that I wrote a few years ago, and so I reviewed the impact evidence. In the same year, another review was produced by Jim Powell, so he's a geologist in the US, and we both came to the conclusion that the evidence is very convincing for this event. So so I said a little bit there about the Younger Dryas impact involving a multitude of comet fragments, but there are other effects that it's thought to have had as well. So I've plotted here, I've reproduced here a plot of what is essentially a reconstruction of climate or temperature over the last 56,000 years in Greenland. So this information is measured essentially from a Greenland ice core, and this temperature variation is plotted over the last 56,000 years up to about 4,000 years ago. And you can see that the temperature is thought to have varied considerably in Greenland, and by the same token, it's thought that the temperature varied considerably across the northern hemisphere as well. But then the period that we're particularly interested in is this region here, starting about 12,850 years ago. So that's this white band here, and you can see that the temperature suddenly seems to dip, and it stays low, and then it recovers about 1,200 years later. So this is the Younger Dryas period, and it suggested that this impact event actually triggered this cooling, this mini ice age at this time. Now also on this plot you can see these silhouettes of these animals, and so what we see is that about the same time as the onset of the Younger Dryas period, there are a bunch of megafaunal extinction events. So a lot of different species of megafauna, that's large animals, became extinct on various continents, and there are many more than are plotted here. But there seems to be a high correlation between the onset of the Younger Dryas period and these extinction events. So that's one thing that suggested that the impact triggered. Down here is some data from a paper just last year. These scientists investigated what's called an extirpation event. So an extirpation is a local extinction. So they were analyzing information locally in California, and they found that 5 out of the 7 species that they were looking at for this local extirpation, the dates of their extirpation agree very closely with the Younger Dryas impact. So it's consistent with the impact hypothesis as triggering or causing those local extirpations too. So there's the death of megafauna, potentially implicated in this impact, as well as the Younger Dryas cooling. Another effect is thought to be the end or the beginning of the end of what's known as the Clovis culture. So this is a particular culture of people that lived in North America at around that time. They're distinguished, or they're characterized by their particular archaeology. And so you can see here the radiocarbon ages or dates for a series of campsites thought to belong to Clovis people. And you can see they end at about the same time as this megafaunal extinction occurs. And here we have the onset of the Younger Dryas period here. Now, although the uncertainty, which is the imprecision in our knowledge of these Clovis campsites is shown on this plot, what's not shown on this plot is the uncertainty in the megafaunal extinction or the onset of the Younger Dryas period. If you take account of all of the uncertainty in all of these things, there is a reasonable chance that they were synchronous. Okay? It's not shown on the plot, this plot, that the Younger Dryas was synchronous, but there's enough uncertainty in the dating such that all of these things could be synchronous. So there were many effects proposed for this Younger Dryas impact. However, the best evidence for the impact occurs at the base of the Younger Dryas black mat. So this is a layer of discolored sediment, you can see it here, that occurs widely across the United States. It occurs also in places in South America, it occurs in places in Western Europe, and also in places in Turkey, including close to Göbekli Tepe. And it doesn't always look like this. It has different characteristics, different shades, different intensities. But at the base of the Younger Dryas black mat is often found the microscopic geochemical signals of a cosmic impact. So these are things like nanodiamonds, abundant or excess platinum, and microspherules that look just like impact microspherules. So when you consider all the evidence together, there's a very compelling case that this impact actually occurred. It remains a very controversial topic, though, and last year a very long, incredibly long review of the whole topic was published by a group of skeptical scientists, and they essentially rubbished the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. However, if you read their paper, as I have, I've read their paper in great detail, and it's full of errors and flaws. I would say that probably their review paper is about 95% rubbish itself. And if you're interested in the detailed scientific arguments, you can go to my blog and read. I've reviewed large sections of their paper and critiqued it in detail, line by line. If that interests you, then you can go to my blog and read this, and we'll be trying to get this, all these arguments published as a paper shortly. So now one of the key, probably the key evidence in this interpretation of Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe in terms of relating it to the Younger Dryas impact is the strength of the correlation as we see it between what we see on Pillar 43 and what we expect to see on Pillar 43 if our hypothesis is correct. So there's this very strong correlation that we see. We tried to estimate that, sort of evaluate numerically that correlation in our 2017 paper. I'm not going to go into that evaluation or the statistics. I just want to point out here what we see as that correlation. So we assume, or we consider that this circle, this disk here, is the sun on the summer solstice. And we assume, or we assume that these animal symbols are constellations, and they're related to the Greek constellations. So if you look in astronomical software like Stellarium, for a constellation that looks like the head and wings of this bird of prey here, on the summer solstice, when the sun is in this position, you find that the only constellation that has that kind of shape is the Sagittarius, or part of the Sagittarius constellation. So that forms the beginning of our hypothesis. We're assuming that this is the case. What we then want to check is, does the rest of the pillar back that up? So if this is true, then below Sagittarius we should find a Scorpion constellation, and indeed we find a Scorpion on the pillar. Then to the left of the Scorpion we should find Lupus, the mad dog or wolf. And on the pillar we have what looks like a canine symbol in a very similar kind of pose. So that is a really strong indication already that this is probably the correct interpretation. Underneath the Scorpion we have Libra. On the pillar we have what looks like a goose or a duck, probably a goose. So that doesn't seem to match, although you might be able to imagine that Libra perhaps can be viewed as a goose perhaps. To the right of the Scorpion and Sagittarius, we should see Ophiuchus struggling with his giant serpent. We don't see that, but we do see this constellation, or this animal, struggling with what looks like a serpent. So there's a partial symbolic match there perhaps. And also the shape of Ophiuchus is not that different to the overall shape of this group of animals. So you can see that could work too. In our interpretation, these upper symbols correspond to the other three solstices and equinoxes of the given year. So we have the summer solstice here. So this is therefore the winter solstice, the autumn equinox, and the spring equinox. And these are the constellations we think corresponding to those. So at the time of the Younger Dryas impact, the corresponding constellation would have been in the position of the autumn equinox would have been Pisces. Now we don't see two birds here, but we do see a symbol with very, very similar shape to Pisces. So again, that's a really strong indication that this interpretation could be right. In the middle here, we expect to see Gemini. Now Gemini can be viewed as a horizontal quadruped or a quadruped viewed from the side, and that's what we see here. And on the right, for the spring equinox, we expect to see Virgo, and that means we expect to see a quadruped in a vertical orientation with splayed limbs, and again, that's exactly what we see here. Now you might think, well, perhaps a few of those matches could be coincidence, but the argument is that when you put them all together, the probability that this has occurred simply by chance is very low, and therefore that indicates that this interpretation is probably correct. So that's the argument that we made in the paper. So what I'm going to do now is show you or explain the evidence that we think that supports this connection between the symbols at Göbekli Tepe and the Younger Dryas impact particularly. And there are lots of different strands to this evidence. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, these 8 different items here. There's actually more than this, but I don't have time to go through it all, so I'm just going to focus on these 8 things here. Before I do that, I just want to give a quick introduction to Göbekli Tepe. So here is Göbekli Tepe. This is the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So it's at the heart of the region that's known as the Fertile Crescent. And so down here we have the Levant. Down here to the right we have Mesopotamia. And Göbekli Tepe itself is on quite a reasonably high hill, and it has an excellent view over the plain of Haran to the south, and it's a great spot for naked eye astronomy. So this is a little video of Göbekli Tepe that I took a couple of years ago when I visited the site. You can see that this part of the site is formed from these large enclosures with these giant megaliths, and it's these megalithic T-shaped pillars that have all the interesting symbols on them that we are trying to decode. So you can see it's a very large site. Actually, this is just a small part of the total site. Ground-penetrating radar shows that the site extends way beyond this, and there are many more large enclosures like these ones waiting to be excavated. This is a detailed map of enclosure D, which is the enclosure that we're going to focus on in this presentation. So this map shows all the different construction, or I should say reconstruction phases for this particular enclosure, because it was modified many times. So the earliest phase is this one in dark blue, and then we have light blue, and so on. So there are many phases. Now, the earliest radiocarbon dates that we have for Göbekli Tepe correspond to this light blue phase. That's the second phase of reconstruction. Okay, so there was one from here and another radiocarbon date from here. And both of those radiocarbon dates are 9,530 BC to within a few hundred years. So it's extremely old. But that is not the oldest part, as I said, of this enclosure. The oldest part is this darker blue part of the southern wall. There are no radiocarbon dates for that part of the enclosure, so we don't really know how old that enclosure is. We don't know when it began. But given the age of the second phase of reconstruction, we can suggest that that enclosure began probably before 9,600 BC, which suggests it may have an origin within the Younger Dryas period itself. Here I'm showing a view of enclosure E. So this is just outside of the area where the main enclosures are in that video that I showed you. You can see two deep pits here in the foreground, and then beyond that there's an area of smooth bedrock. Okay, and in the middle of this area of smooth bedrock are two stone sockets, and there would have been tall pillars embedded in those stone sockets, and presumably there would have been enclosure walls and perhaps other pillars around that. Now the pillars and the walls have gone, they're no longer there, obviously. So one possibility is that those pillars were reused in the reconstruction of the other enclosures that I was talking about earlier. There are no radiocarbon dates for enclosure E, so nobody knows how old enclosure E is, but given that its pillars are missing, it's quite possible that it's older than the other enclosures that I showed you. So the point is that no one really knows how old Göbekli Tepe is, but I suggest its life began earlier than the radiocarbon dates that I showed you, probably in the Younger Dryas period. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly go through these different items, which all build up the case that supports this interpretation that links Göbekli Tepe to the Younger Dryas impact. So we're going to start with pillar 18. So pillar 18 is one of the central pillars in enclosure D. You can see at the bottom here, this is the Nebra sky disk. That's got nothing to do with Göbekli Tepe. It's a bronze or potentially Iron Age artifact. I think it was found in Germany or thereabouts. And you can see and it's generally accepted that this Nebra sky disk displays astronomical information. So we have what appears to be the sun, the moon. We have what appears to be the Pleiades star cluster. So that's a group of 7 stars, or 7 dots here. This thing at the bottom, it's not clear what that is, but it could be indicating a comet. If we now look at photographs of pillar 18 from Göbekli Tepe, we see similar symbols. We have what could be the sun with a little dimple in it, the moon. I hope you can see these two symbols there at that position. At the base of the pillar, we have 7 little birds. Now, in myths across the world, the Pleiades star cluster is often represented in terms of 7 sisters or 7 birds, or 6 or 7 birds. So this could be representing the Pleiades. And as already discussed, we have the front of the pillar, which you can imagine could be representing a comet. So there's a lot of similarities here. Nobody really objects to interpreting the Nebra sky disk astronomically. So I suggest that we have good grounds for interpreting pillar 18 astronomically, is what I would say. So now let's go back to pillar 43. If this is the sun, there was the crescent moon, then surely this is the sun too. Although it doesn't have the dimple in it, we have a nice round circle. So that justifies our interpretation that this is the sun, perhaps on the summer solstice, because we see similar symbols here. Archaeologists that work at the site have proposed that this circle is instead a head or a skull. I suggest if this was meant to be a head or a skull, it would look like a head or a skull. It looks like a plain circle. It's suggested that this head belongs to this person down here, but But if you visit the site and look at this, you can see that it's a perfectly plain circle. I think it's more likely that it's representing the sun. So now I want to talk about this link between constellations, animal symbols, and myth. So there's now quite a few papers that make the case that there are strong connections between myth, animal symbols, and constellations far back deep in time. And that's because there are so many similarities between myths from around the world in some particular cases that a common origin much earlier in time, before people dispersed across the world, seems likely. So we're talking about going back perhaps 50,000 years before mankind spread across the world. In particular, there are stories about the Pleiades, which I mentioned before, and they are often described as 6 or 7 birds or 6 or 7 sisters. Likewise, the Plough constellation, or the Big Dipper constellation, is often associated with a hunt, and it's quite often a bear that's being hunted. So again, it's these similarities around the world that makes us think that there are very deep time connections. So what this tells us is that some kinds of astronomical symbolism can perhaps survive for extremely long periods of time, which is interesting. And it tells us that there is a connection between myth, animal symbols, and constellations. If we now go forward in time, so later than Göbekli Tepe, into the Bronze Age cultures of the Near East, if we consider the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition, scholars have analyzed texts from Babylonia, and they find that there are at least 46 constellations named in those sources. Most of them are written in Sumerian, which means that most of them will probably have an origin in the 3rd or perhaps even the 4th millennium BC. So these are old constellations. And many of them are associated with animals or mythological characters or objects. But again, we see this link between myth, animals, and constellations. We have a similar kind of pattern in ancient Egypt. So the Old Kingdom, in Old Kingdom Egypt, we know that the Egyptian religion is strongly linked to astronomy, and we know that Egyptian deities are often represented with these as sort of hybrid human-animal figures. So again, we see this connection between animal symbols, myth or religion, and constellations or astronomy. Now, Klaus Schmidt, who was the lead excavator, the first lead excavator of Göbekli Tepe, he even suggested that there could be a link between the symbolism of Göbekli Tepe and some of these more recent Bronze Age cultures. So he suggested that the serpents that we see at Göbekli Tepe could have survived in terms of symbolism through to the Egyptian Wadjet symbol, and that the boar symbols that we see at Göbekli Tepe could have survived into a mythical Greek boar. But if that kind of thinking is good enough for Klaus Schmidt, then it's good enough for me too. So we can actually extend that kind of thinking, and we find that actually if we think about the oldest and some of the most well-known Egyptian deities, we can link them directly to many of the figures on these pillars. So there may be many connections between Göbekli Tepe and the symbols in later cultures. We also see at Karahan Tepe, which is not far from Göbekli Tepe and thought to be of a similar age, we see these hybrid animal-human type statues. Again, that makes us think of the ancient Egyptian deities. So putting that all together then, we see both in deep time and in more recent cultures this connection between constellations, animals, symbols, and myth. So that kind of justifies our interpretation of the animal symbols as being potentially constellations. Okay, so this all supports that idea that it's reasonable to take this view that these could be constellations. Now I want to talk about Alexander Gerstein's prediction. So he was a Russian astronomer and a historian of science. He died a few years ago, unfortunately. But he made a prediction that he expected Neolithic cultures to write down the world age in terms of 4 constellations corresponding to the solstices and equinoxes. So that was his prediction. Before I get into a bit more about that, I want to mention this article by David Hughes. He suggested that any culture that observes the solstices and equinoxes carefully enough and for long enough will notice precession of the equinoxes. He was particularly thinking about the builders of Stonehenge, because the culture there survived for hundreds of years, and there are known or expected, we observe solar alignments at Stonehenge as well. But his arguments about the people at Stonehenge apply equally to any culture that observes the solstices and equinoxes accurately for long enough, perhaps 100 years, several generations. And this agrees with Giulio Magli. He suggests that ancient cultures like the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Indus Valley, their astronomical observations were sufficiently good, he suggests, that probably they knew about precession too. So just to make it clear, when I say precession, I mean precession of the equinoxes. So this is, the Earth has a rotational axis, and that axis precesses, it wobbles over a 26,000-year cycle. And what the effect of that is that over this 26,000-year cycle, the summer and winter solstices and the autumn and spring equinoxes, they rotate around the zodiacs. They point to different constellations on the zodiac over 26,000 years. And that allows you to write down a date in terms of the 4 constellations of the solstices and equinoxes. So Gershtein had a similar idea, and he thought that the world's first farmers, which he thought farming, he was working about 25 to 30 years ago, Gershtein, and at that time it was believed that farming began in the Fertile Crescent around about 6000 BC. And so he thought that these earliest farmers, farming would have been very dependent on the seasons. The seasons are determined by the sun, and therefore the earliest farmers would have paid attention to the solstices and equinoxes, and they would have noticed precession, he thought, and therefore he expects that they would have written down the world age in terms of 4 constellations, the solstices and equinoctial constellations. So he thought that began about 6000 BC. But actually his arguments about Neolithic farmers apply equally to hunter-gatherers, really. I mean, they are just as dependent on the seasons for all their resources. So that means that we can expect this kind of dating or writing down of a world age using 4 constellations. We can expect that to occur much earlier. In fact, if you extend back Gerstein's table back to the Younger Dryas impact event, then you would predict the world age would be written in terms of Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Gemini. So that's what you would do if you that's what you get if you extend Gerstein's table backwards to the Younger Dryas impact. It turns out that is exactly how we interpreted Pillar 43. We had Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Gemini on this pillar. So we didn't know at the time what we were doing. Essentially, we were confirming or supporting, let's say, we were supporting Gerstein's prediction that the world age would be written in terms of 4 constellations. That's what we think we see on this pillar. Actually, the artists who made this pillar are even more sophisticated than that. They didn't just write down 4 constellations, they actually showed the position of the sun relative to one of them, and that allowed you to write a date with even greater accuracy. So it looks like the builders of Stonehenge were more sophisticated than even Gershtein had anticipated. So having interpreted Pillar 43 in this way and learned that it seems that people were doing this, using this type of code to write down a world age, we can think about, well, can we apply that to later cultures? Can we see this symbolism, similar symbolism in later cultures? Can we see it in earlier cultures? So I want to show you now the intercultural master or mistress of animals symbol. It's called intercultural because it appears in many cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean. It appears in Iran and in Indus Valley. It appears in some Celtic cultures as well. And we can track the mistress or the master of animals through time, through Iron Age, Bronze Age, and into the Neolithic. Typically, the master or mistress is holding a pair of animals by the neck. Okay. So here we have an example from Greece, but we can go back through time to the Minoan Greeks. We can go back to the Indus Valley. We see the master of animals. We see 4 animals here with this, with the Pashputi seal, just as Gershtein predicted. We can go back further to Geroft in Iran. We have the master of animals in Sumer as well. And we can go back even earlier. We have the master of animals appearing in 4th millennium BC Egypt. And in these cases, it's generally accepted that these animal symbols are related to the Greek zodiac. So it's thought that we can interpret these as Taurus or Leo. But we can go back further than this. The master or mistress of animals appears even earlier. Here we have an example of a master of animals perhaps holding the 2 serpents. This looks to be a similar deity, but now we have a very long serpent. This looks very much like the Ophiuchus constellation now. I've shown underneath the Ophiuchus constellation from Stellarium. They're very similar. We can see stars in the background as well. So this looks like it could be describing a constellation. So that's 5th millennium BC Iran. But we can go back further to Çatalhöyük, which is in southern Turkey again. So this is now 7th millennium BC, and we see a mistress of animals, a seated mistress of animals holding 2 felines by the neck. But most recently, it's been discovered in Seyburg near Göbekli Tepe, this rock carving. And so again, this looks quite a lot like a master of animals. It could be, this is an early version of the master of animals where we have 2 opposing leopards or lions. So this is important because, as Klaus Schmidt speculated, it suggests or it indicates that symbolism from the time of Göbekli Tepe can indeed survive through to Bronze Age and even Iron Age cultures like ancient Greece. Also, it's generally viewed that some of these animal symbols in the more modern cultures are related to the Greek zodiac. So if those animals are related to the Greek zodiac, and the master of animals we've seen can survive for thousands of years, then perhaps the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe can also be related to the Greek zodiac. So this justifies in some way our interpretation of those animal symbols on pillar 43 in terms of the Greek zodiac. Here I'm showing some Geroft handbags now, or stone weights, popularly known as handbags. I showed you this one before. So here we have a master of animals with animal symbols that are consistent with the Greek zodiac and Gerstein's prediction. There are many examples of these stone weights with the zodiac-like animal symbols on them. But the particular feature I want to point out is not the animals now, but it is this semicircular handle or hole in the item. This is quite consistent across the handbags, this semicircular hole, and we see it with the Master of Animals symbol. I suspect this semicircular hole is indicating a sunset symbol. We can see something similar on an even earlier artifact from Uruk. So this is the Uruk vase, mid-4th millennium BC. And here again we have what look like sunsets, or these semicircles on platforms, and above them are zodiac-like animal symbols. We have here a feline, which reminds us of Leo, and here we have a goat, perhaps, an ibex, And we're not familiar with that in the Greek zodiac, but in 1965, the astronomer Bill Hartner suggested this, in this type of context, the goat could be Aquarius, and that would fit very well with Gerstein's prediction. So this is consistent with Gerstein's idea. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, we see that a semicircle on a horizon, this is actually sort of between two hills, but a semicircle on a horizon is known to mean the sun or a day. So this is in like a Sumerian pictograph, which then is transformed in later years into the cuneiform writing. So this is an earlier pictograph. So this semicircle means the sun. If you turn it on the side, then the same symbol means 1 day or 10 days and so on. So a sunset or a semicircle is used to indicate both the sun and units of time. Here's another example. So this rock graffiti in the Theban desert in Egypt was discovered by Darnell and Darnell, and they interpreted this graffiti to indicate the Scorpion King. So here we have a hawk above a scorpion, and in Egyptian hieroglyphics that does mean the Scorpion King. But this rock graffiti scene occurs earlier than Egyptian hieroglyphics actually begins. And so now they didn't have, and they thought this guy over here was the actual Scorpion King. That was their interpretation. But they didn't have a particularly good explanation for what this symbol up here was. They thought it was perhaps a boat or a seat. But now we can interpret this as a semicircle and probably a sunset, and therefore indicating that these are zodiacal animal symbols. And in fact, we see on pillar 43, we see a bending bird struggling with a snake. On pillar 43, we see a bird of prey above a scorpion. On pillar 43, we see tall bending birds. It's not clear whether we see an ibex on pillar 43, but we've just seen that we can interpret the ibex as potentially something like Aquarius. So all of this can be interpreted as essentially writing a date using the zodiac and precession. And if that's the case, then this guy over here is not the Scorpion King, he's Orion, probably, with his very obvious belt. Oops. So there seem to be many cases where we can interpret in later cultures these semicircles in the context of animal symbols using a zodiacal dating system consistent with Gerstein's prediction. We see the same thing on pillar 43. So this supports our view or interpretation that pillar 43 uses the same system. I suspect that this system involving semicircles and animal symbols probably survived through time, and it's probably already there in the archaeological record. It's just been overlooked so far. Probably if we look again, we will find more examples like this. So then what links all the symbolism to the Younger Dryas impact? So if this is the summer solstice and this is the constellation Sagittarius, then we can use astronomical software like Stellarium to find out when the sun was in this position on the summer solstice. And we find a date of about 10,950 BC. Now the date of the Younger Dryas impact is supposed to be about 10,850 BC to within about 50 years. So there's very close agreement there, and that's one of the main reasons we think this could be linked to the Younger Dryas impact. In recent years, we've been able to decode a few more symbols on pillar 43. I'll just tell you about that now. So I was contacted a few years ago by a guy called John Rogers from America, and he pointed out that this line of symbols here on pillar 43, this can be interpreted as a lunar cycle. Okay, so the lunar cycle is 29.5 days. So if you count the number of days between successive full moons, you'll alternately get 29, 30, 29, 30, and so on. Now what we have here are 15 V symbols in a row and 14 lambda symbols. Okay, so we've got 15 V symbols and 14 lambda symbols. If you count the V symbols from right to left, you'll get 15. If you count the V symbols back again, you'll get 30. But if you count the lambda symbols back again, you'll get a total of 29. So using this particular construction, you can alternately count 29, 30, 29, 30. Probably this is indicating a lunar cycle. Underneath, we have 11 small boxes. I suspect that these 11 small boxes mean repeat the above count. That would mean that we then have 12 lunar months, a total of 12 lunar months, including the first one. 12 lunar months is 354 days. Underneath these boxes, we have 10 more V and lambda symbols. If we add that to the total, we have 364 days. So we're 1 day short of a full solar year. But if you look at this bird of prey, it has a V symbol at its neck. We've already interpreted this bird of prey as indicating the summer solstice constellation. So perhaps this V symbol is a special day in the year, the summer solstice. So we can add that to the count and get 365 days. So this would be potentially a lunar-solar type of calendar on pillar 43. Now that's really interesting because it looks like there are now two different ways of arriving at the view that this bird of prey is symbolizing the summer solstice. We have one way which is analyzing the animal symbols, which I showed you, and we have another way of coming to the same conclusion by reading these V's and boxes. So that tends to reinforce this view that we have got this interpretation correct. Now you might say, well, this V symbol here, that could just be plumage or it could just be decoration. So let me now show you the Erferman. Here is the Erferman, discovered in Schanlurfer, dating to around the same time as Göbekli Tepe. And here is that rock carving again at Seeberge. Probably these two are the same deity or the same thing, same guy. They have a very similar pose. And they both have V symbols at the neck. So this suggests that these V symbols at the neck are not just decoration. Probably they have a special meaning. And probably it's related to time. We already interpreted this guy as the master of animals, or the master of precession, or the master of precessional time. So perhaps he's the master of daily time, or just the master of time, full stop. Same as this guy. And this, it was first noticed by my partner Claire that these images had the V symbol at the neck. So that reinforces the view that the V symbol at the neck of the bird of prey could also be indicating time or counting a day. So now let's have a look at pillar 33. So this is another pillar in enclosure D where we find pillar 43 and pillar 18. On one side of this pillar we have a fox, which seems to have rays or bunches of rays or something coming out of its body. Actually, if you look on the front face of the pillar, it's clear that these are snakes. These are snake heads on the front face of the pillar. So this fox has snakes emanating from its body. On the other face of the same pillar, I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but we have birds, these tall bending birds. And they have snakes coming out of their body, and the snake heads converge on the front face of the pillar. So what does it mean to have snakes emerging or radiating from animals? Presumably this indicates that these are not depictions of real animals, because this doesn't happen in nature. Possibly you could interpret this as being mythological animals. So maybe there would be some way you could describe these serpents emanating from animals mythologically. If we interpret these, the bird and the fox, in terms of constellations, then it becomes obvious that these snakes are probably representing meteors. So we can now, this looks like a very nice picture of a meteor stream, the way the snakes are bunched and emanating from the animal symbols. So if this is a picture of a meteor stream, which meteor stream is it? We have previously decoded the tall bending bird to indicate a constellation similar to Pisces. Now, at the time that Göbekli Tepe was occupied, astronomical calculations indicate that the Taurid meteor stream would have radiated from Pisces and Aquarius, which we think is the Fox. So if this is a meteor stream, then probably it's the Taurid meteor stream. And remember, it's the Taurid meteor stream that is implicated in the Younger Dryas impact. So maybe this is the picture of the Taurid meteor stream. If we look at the front face of that pillar, we see these snakes coming downwards. And to the sides, we have more of these lambda symbols. And remember, we thought the lambda symbol was counting days. There are 13 lambda symbols on the right next to the fox and 14 lambda symbols on the left next to the birds. So does this tell us then that the Taurid meteor stream radiated from the direction of the fox for 13 days, and then it radiated from the direction of the bird for 14 days? It could be. So when we put this all together, we think we have a date very similar to the Younger Dryas impact. Pillar 33, we think, is probably a meteor stream, and the Taurid meteor stream, which is implicated in the Younger Dryas impact. And we have this guy without his head, presumably indicating death. Put that all together, and that's what makes us think that this is probably a memorial to the Younger Dryas impact. Now that would make quite a lot of sense. Archaeologists have been trying to understand why Göbekli Tepe was built at this time. So why do we see this monumental architecture develop at this time in history? Because we don't see this scale or complexity of architecture before, or symbolism before this time. In fact, we don't really see it after this time for a few more thousand years. So it's very interesting that it appears right now in the historical record. And the way that archaeologists, or some of them, explain this is that they think that there was a change in the belief system of these people. See, a great deal of motivation is needed to spend a lot of time constructing these pillars and enclosures, and that requires a great deal of organization and motivation, and therefore belief. So they suggest that there was perhaps some kind of new religion or cult, or an increase in the effort that was expended on an existing cult or religion. But that's pretty much, I agree with that. That's a very interesting and useful view. I think the Younger Dryas impact actually helps us because it gives us this unique event which explains why this monumentality is seen at this time. The Younger Dryas impact would have been very dangerous, very damaging. It would have created great fear. And we know that fear is a very powerful organizing force. Think of our response to the COVID crisis, for example. So it is a good way, I think, to explain why we see Göbekli Tepe and other places like it at this particular time. So I suspect that there was probably a comet cult or a death cult related to the Younger Dryas impact. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there for a little bit. I've finished there the first part describing our interpretation of Göbekli Tepe. Having learned about this, how to interpret this symbolism, I'm now going to take you back in time, thousands of years before Göbekli Tepe, into the Paleolithic period, particularly to the Lascaux Cave, which is dated to around 15,000 BC. But there are many caves with these wonderful painted artworks that go right back through the Upper Paleolithic period, even back to about 35,000 years ago, or even earlier. So we want to try and understand what these paintings were all about. What were they up to? Well, hunter-gatherers, it's generally believed that people in this period, the Upper Paleolithic, were hunter-gatherers. And as I explained, it would make sense for hunter-gatherers to be interested in astronomy, to observe the solstices and equinoxes, because all their resources would have been seasonal, just like farmers. So we can say that we can expect that hunter-gatherers at that time would have been interested in the solstices and equinoxes. And perhaps that's what these symbols are about, because these animal symbols in these painted caves are very similar to the ones we see at Göbekli Tepe. So that's an expectation, but what does the evidence show? Hayden and Villeneuve, in 2011, they wrote a review of evidence for astronomy in the Upper Paleolithic. One of the most important things they did was perform an ethnographic survey of relatively modern hunter-gatherers. So hunter-gatherer tribes that have existed over the last 50 to 100 years, say, and have been researched and documented. And they consulted a database of this ethnographic data. And what they found is that most relatively modern hunter-gatherer tribes were interested in astronomy and had names for the stars and so on. But even more importantly, what they found is that the most complex hunter-gatherer groups were interested in the solstices and equinoxes, and even had, for example, festivals on the solstices and equinoxes. So it seems that this expectation is borne out in terms of modern, or relatively modern, hunter-gatherer tribes. And the argument then is that, well, if that's true for modern hunter-gatherer tribes, it could also be true for ancient hunter-gatherer tribes. Hayden and Villeneuve also analysed the work of Alexander Marshak. So he was an anthropologist who was studying in the 1960s and 70s. He was cataloguing and studying various kinds of tally stick, Paleolithic tally stick. There are many kinds. Here is one example that Marshak studied and examined, and it shows, well, it's made of, it's a deer antler, I think. And on this side, on this edge, we have 14 notches, or sort of semicircular notches, and underneath we have 15 notches. So for the same reason that we can interpret the V symbols on Göbekli Tepe as describing a lunar cycle, probably this is a tally stick for counting a lunar cycle as well. So this indicates that Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were actually interested in astronomy, in this case lunar astronomy, but astronomy in any case. Another important thing that Hayden and Villeneuve did is they reviewed the work of Chantal Djegez-Volkovich, and I'm sure I've pronounced her name incorrectly, I'm sorry about that. Now her work isn't very easily accessible. It's not written up in, I would say, standard academic journals. So Hayden and Villeneuve visited her, and they spoke with her about her data, and they've reproduced her data in their review paper. So what Chantal was doing was analysing painted caves. So that's these caves with artworks in them. She was analysing the orientation of the entrances to these caves. Okay, and it seems to her, or according to her data, the orientations of the painted cave entrances seem to follow a pattern, and that is they generally seem to be aligned to either the setting or the rising sun on the solstices or the equinoxes. In fact, the most popular orientation apparently was the setting sun on the summer solstice. Of course, when she looked at undecorated or unpainted caves, they didn't seem to have any particular orientation whatsoever. As you'd expect, it would be completely random. So what this suggests is that ancient hunter-gatherers were choosing caves for their paintings which have particular solar orientations, which I think is very interesting. Here's a particular example, probably the most famous cave of all. This is Lascaux Cave. So this is a map of Lascaux looking down, and I've measured here the orientation of its entrance. This is the Hall of Bulls, that's the entrance to the cave. And very closely, to within about 3 degrees, it's aligned with the setting sun on the summer solstice. So if you look down the axis of this entranceway, you'll see the sun, as it sets, is about 3 degrees, if you look in this direction, above the horizon. So it's not quite perfectly aligned to the summer solstice setting sun. However, this assumes a flat entrance or flat horizon to the cave. If you look at this image of the cave entrance, so this is now a side view of the cave entrance, okay? And you can see that the cave entrance slopes upwards according to this diagram by Leroy Guerin. So in this case, it looks like the slope is about right, such that there is a very good solar orientation, a very close orientation towards the setting sun on the summer solstice if you're looking up this slope here. So that would mean that the back of the cave would be illuminated only on the summer solstice as the sun is setting, and perhaps a few days or a week on either side, if this diagram is correct. So that's another indication that these the people that painted this cave chose it because of its orientation. Now, with my colleague Alistair Coombs, we went another step. So we examined in a paper in 2019, we compared the radiocarbon dates of all of the animal paintings, Paleolithic animal paintings in Western European caves. And we compared those radiocarbon dates that are published in academic journals with the expected zodiacal date if these animal paintings were being painted on the solstices and equinoxes according to some particular zodiac to mark the solstices and equinoxes. So we're comparing essentially a radiocarbon age with a zodiacal age and looking at that difference. Now, if our idea is wrong, so in other words, if these animal paintings have got nothing to do with representing the solstice or equinoctial constellations, if our idea is wrong, then we would expect there to be we would expect all of these points, each point here represents a particular painting. We would expect all these points to be uniformly distributed vertically on this plot. There would be no correlation. It turns out that nearly all of these animal paintings, all of these dots, fall below this horizontal line at around 1,500 year difference. Now, statistically, that's extremely unlikely to occur by chance. Extremely unlikely. So this suggests that our idea that essentially these people were doing what Gershtein had predicted, which is painting animal symbols on the solstices and equinoxes corresponding to their particular zodiac, it suggests that that view is correct. So what it suggests is that these animal paintings, statistically, are very, very likely to actually represent constellations. And that kind of idea has been expressed before by Michael Rappengluck. So he had also taken the view and in published papers that the animal symbols in these painted caves probably represent constellations. So now let's look at the Lascaux Shaft Scene. So in the Lascaux Cave complex, right at the sort of the deepest part of that cave complex, down a shaft is this sort of secret chamber. Down at the bottom in this secret chamber, you have on one wall, you have painted this scene. This is known as the Lascaux Shaft Scene. So we have a bull, we have a rhinoceros, we have a bird on a stick, and we have a dying man. What you don't often see is that on the back wall there is a fourth animal symbol, which is a horse. So here we have four animal symbols in a dying man, which looks very similar to Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, the four highlighted animal symbols representing the solstices and equinoxes, and a dead man. So does that mean that this picture is illustrating another cosmic impact event? But remember, I also showed you evidence that these animal paintings in fact represent constellations. Statistically, that seems very likely according to the data that we have. So what does it mean if a constellation is pierced by a spear and it's disemboweled? How could we interpret a constellation being pierced by a spear? One obvious thing is to think that this is another picture of a meteor stream. So this could be another meteor impact, and that's why this guy is dying. Again, we can ask which meteor stream. Now, according to the zodiac that we had deduced from Göbekli Tepe, which is what we were using to interpret this cave, the bull represents a constellation similar to Capricornus. And it turns out that the Taurid meteor stream at the time this cave was occupied, would have emanated from the direction of Capricornus. So perhaps, once again, this is another picture of the Taurid meteor stream, just as we think it occurs at Göbekli Tepe. Now, we have pretty solid evidence for the Younger Dryas impact, but we have no evidence whatsoever for an impact at this time when this cave was occupied. However, I want to show you this work, this data from Barchet Schmidt in 2016. So they looked at campsites for the Magdalenian culture. So this is a particular group of people that lived in northern Spain and southern France. And they recorded all these archaeological remains for their campsites over time. Now I'm sure you can't see this axis down here. This is the date for these campsites. It goes from 20,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago on the right-hand side. This red dotted line I've put in onto this plot, this is the date when the Lascaux Cave was occupied and is the date that we deduce from the Lascaux Shaft Scene as well. As you can see, in Spain there doesn't seem to be any indication of any break at all. The campsites seem to be continuous throughout this period, but in southern France, there is this break, or this hiatus in occupation or population at about the same time, or exactly the same time, as these paintings in Lascaux were made. So perhaps this is indicating that there was some kind of depopulation event in southern France at the time the Lascaux Cave was populated. Perhaps this is indicating the effect of a cosmic impact at this time. And maybe it took thousands of years for people to return to this area. So I'd just like to conclude. What I've shown you is a way of interpreting symbolism that we think is astronomical symbolism at Göbekli Tepe and at Lascaux and in Paleolithic cave art. And what I'm suggesting is that it has extremely high explaining power. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we can explain many very specific details, such as positions of constellations, groups of animal symbols. We can explain very, very specific details many, many times with only a few assumptions. There are very few assumptions that go into this. And that's the sign of a good theory. Okay, that is what science is based on. You'll have heard of the concept of Occam's razor. Okay? So that is why I recommend this interpretation. It seems that if we're right, it seems that people were recording these events, these cosmic impact events, using a method of recording world ages, using 4 animal symbols, as Gershtein predicted, with depictions of death and depictions of meteors. Now, if what the astronomers have been saying about the Taurid meteor stream is correct, they've been telling us that this has been a dangerous meteor stream, then we should expect to see these kinds of events, I think, recorded in art. So to me, this makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to finish there, and thank you all for your attention. Okay.